everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Marshall eLearning, a Ciphr company. Today we're exploring why diversity and inclusion is about so much more than compliance. I'm Catherine Newbury, I'm Ciphr's Head of Content. Joining me today, I'm delighted to have with me Ann Allcock, who's Head of Diversity at Marshall eLearning, as well as Gregor Brown, who's Head of Account Management at Marshall's. And Gregor, thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome to you both. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks, Catherine.
Very well, thanks.
Great to have you with us. Just to kick us off, we're going to have a look at today's agenda. Points we're going to be covering today include what do we mean by equality, diversity and inclusion, the business benefits of creating a more inclusive workplace culture, tips for creating a culture of inclusion and belonging for all, as well as highlights from Marshall's e-learning and consultancy services that can help you move the dial on inclusion. So Ciphr is a provider of integrated HR, payroll, LMS and recruitment solutions. Our integrated HCM platform helps organisations manage their end-to-end employee lifecycle, helping them to deliver a better employee experience. With Ciphr, organisations can be confident that all their people data is in one place, and they can also integrate specialist third-party applications to Ciphr solutions via API. With the recent acquisition of Marshall eLearning, we also offer a range of off-the-shelf e-learning services and content, which we'll discuss in more detail later on. With that, I'm going to hand over to Anne, and she's going to give you a little bit more of an introduction to Marshall eLearning before diving into DE&I. Thank you, Anne.
Okay, so thanks very much, Catherine. Thanks for that introduction. Really pleased to be with you this morning. So Marshall eLearning is a specialist e-learning company. We focus on diversity and inclusion, and we've been in business for about 20 years or so, but we became part of the Ciphr Group, which is fantastic news, not very long ago now, in spring of this year. And it's been absolutely fantastic opportunity for us here at Marshall's to be working with a really well-established company such as Ciphr, and we're still finding our way around the business and through our various inductions, but we're absolutely delighted to be part of the Ciphr Group. As I mentioned, we've been in business for over 20 years. My boss, the founder of the company, David Marshall, was really keen to set up an e-learning company that had very much a specialist focus, so around diversity and inclusion. And he initially started working with the higher education sector, and we now work with pretty much every university in the UK, and we also engage with and provide services and products across the globe. In fact, yesterday I was just telling Catherine and Gregor, David and I met with the head of diversity at Southern Methodist University in Texas, where they've got some really interesting diversity and inclusion challenges going on there. But now we work with much more, many more sectors. It's not just a higher education focus, and we do really pride ourselves in fantastic customer service. We're really keen to get to know our customers well, and we have exemplary client retention. Many partnerships span more than 10 years. One of the key and most valuable aspects of our e-learning products is that we regularly update our courses to ensure that they're relevant, and if there are any changes to legislation, we make sure that they're really accurate. So that's something that we believe our competitors don't really do, and that sort of sets us aside and sets us apart in the market. The other really important point to mention is that we have specialist subject knowledge expertise. I'm the head of diversity, so my background isn't e-learning, my background is diversity and inclusion, so I bring that real subject knowledge expertise to the content. But we also we develop everything internally. We have our own technical expertise as well, our own instructional designers, and our own developers who actually create the e-learning modules. So that's just a little bit about Marshall eLearning. Please do reach out to us at the end. I hope you find what we're going to talk about today interesting and informative. But if you have any questions at all about our e-learning, do get in touch. Okay, so just before I move on to talk about what is ED&I, equality, diversity and inclusion, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit and give you a bit of context. So, as I mentioned, we're a specialist e-learning provider, and we've been asked, we get asked not infrequently, why do you have so many modules on ED&I? Don't we just need one mandatory course which tells people about the Equality Act? It warns them against falling foul of that legislation, and that module, that compliance module, might sit alongside other topics such as information security, risk management, anti-fraud. So very legislatively based and compliance based. So why do we need more than that? I do think it's a very sensible question. We all know that in order to avoid liability for discrimination that takes place in the workplace and indeed in service delivery, employers must indeed take what's called all reasonable steps to ensure that their employees understand what constitutes unlawful behaviour. And for many companies, the focus of ED&I remains quite narrow and is actually limited to that legal compliance. But I think ticking that compliance box doesn't really mean that you've nailed diversity and inclusion, and it doesn't mean to say that you've maximised all the benefits, the business benefits, the proven business benefits of a diverse workforce and a respectful organisational culture. I think compliance is very much a minimum standard which we should all take as read. We must go beyond that, beyond what must be avoided, i.e. we must go beyond avoiding discrimination. That's clearly critical, but it doesn't mean that all staff feel included or that they belong in your organisation, and not discriminating doesn't automatically translate into a diverse demographic in terms of your workforce profile, where there's a legacy of barriers and bias to dismantle. So today's session really is an overview of diversity and inclusion. It's an opportunity to consider how your organisation can take this forward on behalf of and in partnership with your staff. What really makes a difference to the everyday workplace experience of diverse employees, and how can that translate, very importantly, into business benefit? So one thing I wanted to mention right at the start is the importance of understanding concepts and the nuances of terminology. I've already talked about ED&I, we can talk about D&I, we can talk about DEIB, we can talk about it the other way around, DEI. Different organisations will talk about different things and have different acronyms for this. I think all those components within that broad agenda can tend to merge into one. And we use these acronyms very liberally, sometimes as shorthand, and that is really fair enough, and that's really helpful in one respect. But we've got to remember that each word is a different concept entirely, and we must use the correct language for each specific concept and in each specific context, so it's relevant. And I think for those listening to us speak and discussing about this broad agenda, it can actually come across as quite lazy, maybe a bit inappropriate, maybe to some it's even a little bit offensive to use catch-all phrases that don't really mean anything when you lump all these concepts together. And that involves avoiding kind of platitudes, really. So to get where we want to be, we need to think about each of these in turn. So firstly, diversity. Diversity means difference, which it's a fact, it's a simple fact of the human condition. It's what sets us apart from one another, it's what makes us unique. It's also what unites us and enables us to relate to others and think about which groups we do actually belong to. It encompasses all differences in terms of identity, in terms of characteristics, and that includes not only those that are protected from discrimination under the Equality Act. I'm sure you're very familiar with those 9 protected characteristics, but also other aspects such as diversity of thought, socioeconomic profile, life experiences, educational background, even personality. So if we were using an analogy, diversity is being invited to a party and actually deciding to go along and be there as you are. So what is inclusion then? Well, inclusion it's more about organisational effort and practices that aim to create a culture where all groups and individuals are welcomed and valued. So it's what organisations do to make that a reality for employees every day. So whereas diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act. So again, go back to our party, it's being asked what music you'd like to hear and dance to at the party. And increasingly, we recognise the importance of belonging. So belonging is an emotion that employees experience. It means feeling valued, it means feeling accepted, and it means feeling connected with and to colleagues, teams, the wider organisation. And I think the depth and the frequency of our sense of belonging can fluctuate, but it's related to those acts of inclusion that we just spoke about, are experiences of inclusive practices, inclusive actions and inclusive behaviours that we experience every day. So going back to our party, it's not just coming along to the party as you are, it's not just being asked what music you'd like to hear, it's actually being on the party planning committee, having your ideas heard and acted upon. So you feel like you belong, you're really accepted, you're really welcomed, you're really valued, and you're part of what goes on in the organisation. And I think for any company serious about benefiting from diversity, it's really important to draw those distinctions between creating diversity and building an organisational culture where people feel like they belong. Simply recruiting employees from diverse backgrounds isn't the same as making them feel included, and unless we make people feel included, we'll be missing out on the economic benefits of diversity. Another couple of concepts before we move on. What does the E mean in your organisation if you talk about DEI or ED&I? Is it equality or is it equity? There is an important difference. So in the first image, we're looking at equality, where what we're assuming is that everyone benefits from being treated the same. The same support, the same policies, the same practices, the same ways of doing things. People are treated equally. But in the second image, we recognise that actually some people need different support, different policies, different practices, if we are to give them the same opportunities to see the match in this case and have equal access. And that is equity. And it's maybe worth considering what a third image might look like. Is it possible to remove the fence altogether, to give everyone the same great experience at work by taking away a barrier? And that barrier, it's important to recognise, might not be a physical barrier like a fence, or it might not be a policy, it might be an attitudinal barrier, something like a bias or stereotyping, which can easily, take place within organisations. We have norms, we have stereotypical norms within an organisation where we're used to thinking about a group in one particular way, and we can address those through raising understanding, raising awareness, and try to tackle those barriers in that particular way. So what we're actually looking at is to try to eventually to try and remove those barriers completely. So I think mention the importance of understanding concepts and using terminology wisely and with clarity. Make sure that you're saying what you mean, you understand what you're talking about and actually what you're meaning to say. So let's turn to some benefits and opportunities now. So this is really the generic business case for this broad agenda. What I've got on the slide here is an overview of why embracing this topic makes good business sense. And I'm going to give a couple of more specific research findings on the next slide. But just holistically, a diverse workforce and an inclusive workplace enable a successful organisation. They are a key part of that success. To me, you can't have quality without that diversity, inclusion, equality, equity aspect. So a diverse workforce and an inclusive workplace drive a sense of belonging among staff, and consequently they're committed, they're engaged and they're productive. They underpin innovation and sound business decisions. They help to minimise risk as opportunities, broad opportunities are considered, all perspectives come to the table. Decisions are really, really sound and take on board all different aspects and all different perspectives. A diverse workforce and an inclusive workplace, they make the organisation a very attractive place to work, and so that brings access to the best talent, which stays in the company because your staff feel as though they belong and they become committed. And it's about meeting the expectations of customers and the wider public in terms of value, organisational values, in terms of ethical behaviour, in terms of social governance of your company, which supports a positive reputation for the organisation. And they also help to ensure that products and services are what varied customers or clients or service users actually want and need. So they open up new markets and new business opportunities. But what's really important here is that you identify the importance for your organisation. You know, I've listed a few things there, several aspects about why this agenda makes great business sense. But what's the sweet spot for your organisation? What difference will it make for you? Which of these generic factors stand out? And I think it's really important not to fall into the trap of copying another organisation's strategy or initiatives. You need to understand your particular context, your drivers, your challenges. And that's going to, if you've got that great and really tailored business case, that's going to convince any skeptics about the value of diversity and inclusion. So, for example, are you struggling to recruit? How can you widen your net? How can you attract beyond your usual applicant cohort? What makes you stand out from the crowd as the company of choice for candidates? Or maybe you're falling behind in terms of product development, in terms of innovation. Do you work in an echo chamber? How can you bring new perspectives and ideas to the company? Or are you looking for new markets, or realise you're missing a trick with a whole section of potential clients? So what is your challenge? What is your challenge, and how and why can diversity and inclusion really help? So I've got some research here, which is you know, where different aspects of the business case have been explored. So it's really the cost of failing in this agenda. So the first one, a few years ago, the government commissioned some research into race at work, which was called the McGregor-Smith Review. And Baroness McGregor-Smith found that the potential benefit to the UK economy from full representation of Black, Asian, minority ethnic individuals across the labour market through their improved participation and progression is estimated to be £24 billion a year, which represents actually 1.3% of GDP. So that's quite a significant missed opportunity if we're failing to recruit and promote and use the full opportunities from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community in the UK. You know, we're missing out. We're missing out there. The second one, millennials are significantly more than Gen Xers and baby boomers to consider diversity and inclusion an important factor in a new job. So this research was done by Weber Shandwick, and it's broader, looking at the perspectives of millennials at work. And it's something I find I mention quite frequently with employers. It really signals the importance of diversity and inclusion to younger employees and younger prospective employees. Today's job market, you know, that can really make the difference between securing the best young talent or not. So what are your credentials on diversity and inclusion? How do you actually let people know that you're interested in this topic, you're taking it seriously, you recognise the value of a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture? The third piece of research there was done by Cloverpot. They did research on team decision making. And they found that on average, teams are significantly better at making business decisions than individuals. But not all teams are created equal. And Cloverpop also measured the decision-making of teams based on the gender, age, and geographic location of team members. Their top line observation and they did get high statistical confidence around this, is that as the diversity of teams increases, so does the chance of making better decisions. In fact, the most diverse teams make better decisions 87% of the time. And finally, McKinsey's 2019 analysis finds that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on executive teams are 25% more likely to have above average profitability than companies in the fourth quartile. And that percentage is, they've repeated this research, it's gone up from 21% in 2017 and 15% in 2014. And they also found the greater the representation of women, the higher the likelihood of outperformance. So those are just 4 bits of research. There are many more. There's something around LGBTQ that PwC did a couple of years ago, and they found that only 34% of European high leadership potential survey participants believe that their companies actually leverage LGBTQ plus inclusion for business advantage. And there's some statistics around disability that I have as well. This year, 2023, only 43% of disabled people are economically inactive. And the disability employment gap, which is the difference between employment rate and disabled and those who are not disabled, is 29%. So we're missing so much talent here, I think, in terms of different identities. So what does a journey to diversity and inclusion maturity look like? Well, there are several models like this. This is actually Deloitte's maturity model. They're quite simplistic and they tend to be a bit linear, but they're helpful as they offer a helicopter view and they help you to get a sense check of your whole organisation. They give an indication of a point on a journey towards maturity, which we can see here through the Deloitte model. Level 1 is compliance, and that moves through to level 4, integrated level. So just quickly going through these levels, and I'm going to ask you, we're going to have a poll in a second. I'm going to ask you what level do you think your organisation is at. So just, as we go through, maybe consider that. So the first level is compliance. So this is around complying with legislation, aligning maybe with sector standards, professional standards, if those are relevant. Diversity is a problem that needs managing. Actions are largely reactive, and the responsibility lies with your legal team, maybe with HR, maybe if you have a D&I manager or somebody who's responsible for D&I. Second level, around programs, programmatic, starting to articulate the business case, but D&I still really seen in terms of demographic numbers, i.e. it's about diversity, it's not about inclusion, it's not culture focused. You have ad hoc initiatives to increase the representation of different groups in your workforce. You might have staff networks, you might do mentoring programs, you might run unconscious bias training. Responsibility still tends to stick with HR and maybe the diversity person. Then you move on to leader-led, and this is where you get a more sophisticated understanding, and it's linked to your business strategy. Senior leaders are on board, they accept accountability. The focus shifts from a diversity piece to addressing systemic cultural barriers. There's a strategy around culture change, and D&I can often become part of organisational values, and you start to monitor how you're doing. And now the responsibility shifts more to the leaders of your organisation. And the final integrated level is where it's really recognised that difference can be used to create business value. Inclusive cultures really becomes a pillar of your brand and is integrated into all functions, into behaviours, structures and systems. D&I is led from the top, but the whole organisation has some responsibility. So just be really, really interested to know how mature you think your organisation is when it comes to diversity inclusion and which level you're at.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to share those results now so we can see that around a third each say compliance or programmatic, and 18% say that at level 3, which is leader-led, and 5% say integrated. And does that kind of tally with some of your experiences speaking to clients and prospects?
Yeah, no, that's, you know, it's all absolutely fine, you know, and I think the key thing is understand where you are, and then you know what you need to build on. You know, I think those models are really helpful to give you just a broad sense of what you might achieve moving forward and what you're aiming at. And you know, you can search for different models. Some of them are much more complex than that and approach this in a slightly different way. But I was interested. I was reading the CIPD's inclusion at work report from last year, from 2022. They found that around half of employers do not have a diversity and inclusion strategy or action plan in place, and a quarter say that their D&I activities are entirely or mostly reactive to issues that arise. Just 7% of employers have a specific D&I budget, and there was another snapshot done by in different research, which was actually across six countries, and that came out with exactly this: nearly a third of organisations are stuck in the compliance stage. So, you know, this isn't unusual, you know, and I don't say, you know, don't feel bad, don't worry about it, but you know, it's a springboard. You know, you've got an opportunity to, you know, to really build on where you are, and the important thing is to know your starting point. We've looked at concepts, we've looked at the business case and what the journey to maturity could look like. If we're going beyond compliance and thinking about a culture of inclusion and belonging to unleash those business benefits, what type of things do we need to think about? I've picked just 3 topics here. I'm going to touch on each of them briefly. It's really just bringing us back to that piece, how and why this is so much more than compliance. There are lots of other topics that I could talk about, or we could talk about this morning, but I'm going to mention unconscious bias, micro behaviours and inclusive leadership, and I'm going to give a quick sort of whiz through each of these topics. So unconscious bias, you may well be very familiar with this topic, and you know, you may run training already on it, but I think it is so important. It is so important when we're considering the decisions that we all make every day at work, that all our employees make every day at work. The behaviours that we display are underpinned and impacted by our biases. So we might not like to think about it or realise we're doing it, but the moment we set eyes on someone, we begin to form an impression of them that's based on those immediate things that we see or learn about them. So this is unconscious bias. And we know we have these biases because it's been tested. Psychologists have explored our unconscious or implicit attitudes, and they've done that in 2 main ways. Firstly, by measuring physiological data, such as our heart rate, our skin reactions, maybe the electrical activity in muscle tissue. And these demonstrate the automatic responses we display in reaction to certain, you know, normally visible triggers, things that we see or things that we experience about somebody when we first meet them. They've also measured reaction times to various prompts or stimuli, which can determine to what extent we associate a particular group with a particular set of characteristics. You know, women are caring, you know, to what extent do we each as individuals make that association? What's the strength of that association? So really, unconscious bias refers to the biases that we have, but we don't really consciously control them. And this bias pushes us in a direction that feels right, that we're most used to, that we're comfortable. So it's actually quite counterintuitive for us to resist that, and that's why it's so tricky. But the thing is that our natural tendencies can be really misplaced because we're acting on that really limited information, and the choices and decisions we make, they may not be the most appropriate, they may not be the most reliable decisions. They may not be appropriate, they may not be objective, they may not be the best decisions we can make, because we certainly have a limited amount of knowledge and information at our disposal when we make them. So I really love this image, you know, and it's quite, I don't know, it kind of makes me take a step back, or did when I first saw it. And I think, you know, a question is, what's your reaction? What do you think about? You know, may have all different stuff going on with this picture. I mean, I think one thing that stands out for me is the tattoos are so extreme, yet the guy looks quite formal from the neck down. You know, he has a shirt and tie and a jacket, and I don't know, there's something that doesn't quite match there for me around that. You know, there was research again done which involved, you know, flashing up images of people with facial tattoos, facial disfigurements, or even a different skin color to the person being tested. And the research found, you know, very clearly identified a danger response being triggered in the brain. In other words, the brain associates difference with danger. And, you know, in our developed society, it kind of makes sense when we were more primitive, because we needed to decide whether someone was friend or foe pretty quickly. We don't need to do that so much in our developed society now, but we do need to manage how our brain responds and to be able to have appropriate reactions. So, you know, just you know, obviously not going to discuss this now, but what would you think if this guy came along for interview? What are your first impressions? How comfortable are you? What are you thinking? Would you be thinking, is he suitable for this particular role? You know, is he customer facing? Is he back office? What's the job he's going for? Are you worried whether he'd conform? Would he follow rules? Would he be professional? You know, what is your brain telling you? And then, you know, obviously what you've got to do is think about assessing him more objectively, finding out more about him and his skills and experiences, and whether he actually matches your person spec. So I think, you know, this is an extreme example of where somebody looks very different to most people, but we need to be aware that there are less extreme examples every day which cause our unconscious bias to kick in. So I've heard many times, you know, people who choose to wear traditional or national dress to work can really recognize how that impacts the behavior of others, their choice to wear that dress. You know, they come to work, you know, one day in a dress which is more aligned with what people normally wear, and then one day they'll come in a traditional dress of which reflects their culture or their heritage or their ethnicity. And, you know, what they've said is people relate differently to them. And I think, you know, we just need to think about that. That's our biases kicking in there. And what does that actually mean for those people? So there are some hotspots here in terms of workplace situations or processes that we really need to be alert to, where bias may kick in. And we need to think about what best practice can we adopt to ensure that our bias doesn't affect the quality of our decisions in these processes. So recruitment and selection, and I'm sure again some of this will be familiar to you, but affinity bias is a real risk here. We all tend to see value in the people who are like us, with whom we have something in common. So if we're interviewing, we might notice similarities like appearance or career history, or sharing the same ethnicity. You know, wearing the same jacket. You know, I've got one of those at home, kind of thing. That actually triggers something in our brains, and we like people who are like us. Or maybe a candidate is even similar in some way to the previous job holder. They might even look a little bit like them, and that previous job holder was popular. They were good at their job, and we can subconsciously be influenced. Also, I think, you know, there's a whole category of biases which is around when we treat individuals based on simplistic stereotypes, often treated again triggered by those visual clues. So it's not strictly a workplace recruitment example, but I always like the example around the impact of height, and the fact that the average height of the 46 American presidents is 2 inches taller than the height of the average US male. You know, tall people seem to be favoured by the electorate. What is it about tall people? Why do we recruit tall people? Does it mean they do a better job? I wonder. I don't know. So I think we do. You know, these visual aspects do cause us to think in a certain way about certain people. So what can we do in terms of recruitment selection? Well, work with clear criteria in your job description, apply robust scoring, try not to compare candidates against each other, focus on individual positive qualities, try to have a diverse interview panel where possible, and make sure that those involved in recruitment selection have had unconscious bias training. Recency bias is something that we need to focus on. You know, are you actually focusing on that "what have you done for me lately" bias? You know, somebody's done a really good job or a really dreadful job in something a couple of weeks ago, but you're really trying to document performance at different points through the time period, have a longer term view and review against goals. Set clear goals, set targets to evaluate against, and make sure your assessment of performance is evidence-based and data-driven, and you're not working on instinct or inclination. Work allocation is another area where bias can emerge. In fact, research shows that women and members of other underrepresented groups are more often channeled into project management type, execution type roles. They're less likely to receive high value, high visibility or stretch assignments. So again, be really objective about your criteria for assigning tasks or allocating work. Are you acting on assumptions or stereotypes and not giving people opportunities that they deserve? So there are a few very practical things. If you're making important decisions that affect others, they're not going to be good decisions if you're hungry, if you're exhausted, stressed or rushed. Take a step back, try to give yourself time, reflect on biases that you know you have. Ask other people who are a bit different to you to sense check what you've concluded. And, you know, if you've got a very strong immediate gut reaction and you recognize that, or you know you've had a strong first impression, just take time to revisit that. Okay, micro behaviors then. We all do this stuff. They're expressions of our biases, but they can signal unwittingly whether people are welcome and valued or not, whether people belong or not, whether we think those people belong or not. They're very small behaviors, but they have a big impact. And they can be positive or negative. They can be micro-affirmations or microaggressions. But I think the important thing to remember, even micro-affirmations, if you're affirming, if you're giving positive feedback, if you're giving, you know, lots of nods and good verbal clues to one person all the time, you might not be doing that very fairly. It's an affirmation, but you might not be delivering it equitably and fairly. So just be aware of that. It's not just the microaggressions that we need to think about. And they're often very intangible, throwaway behaviors, and the person on the receiving end can get really worried if they've made it up or if they've imagined the behavior, and that causes stress and can actually damage morale and motivation. So the question for you is, you know, taking this away, what examples of micro behaviors have you seen and experienced? But the key point is we can all recognize them in others, but do we do them ourselves? The chances are that we do to some degree. So just really reflect on that, and that's part of being a really, you know, somebody who's alert to dynamics within the organisational culture. So inclusive leadership then it's an approach to leading and managing. We've touched on the benefits of diverse teams, but we've also mentioned that throwing a mix of people together doesn't guarantee high performance. It does include this active and inclusive leadership to make sure that all team members are treated respectfully and fairly, they're valued, they have a sense that they belong, they're confident, they're inspired. But what's, you know, sometimes people think, oh, this is a really form of leadership, it's a really unfocused, soft form of leadership. I don't think that's the case. You know, inclusive leaders, there's nothing to stop them being goal focused and committed to getting really good results. But it's the way in which they do that. They're absolutely committed to doing that by utilising the diversity of their team, maximising that diversity, and bringing that to actually create really great solutions and great results. I think it's quite a courageous approach, because it does look to those in positions of power, and it can be senior leaders, but it can also be on the line management level, you know, day-to-day line management. it does require those leaders, those managers, to demonstrate characteristics like humility and authenticity, which can be seen to make people a little bit vulnerable. So it is something that takes a bit of courage to do, I think. So what we've got here, and again, I haven't reinvented the wheel, this is Deloitte's model, characteristics of inclusive leaders. They've identified 6 key characteristics, and just run through them really quickly. Inclusive leaders are committed. They're committed to diversity and inclusion, and they're committed in the way in which they understand that they need to stay the course. You know, progress doesn't happen overnight. They need to be engaged with this topic for the long term, and they allocate time, they allocate energy to speak about diversity and inclusion and to address it. As I mentioned, they're courageous, and they're courageous because they are not only a little bit vulnerable, they're honest about strengths and weaknesses. They talk about imperfections. That means potentially taking a risk, but they also challenge. They're courageous because they challenge the status quo in themselves. They recognise what they need to change in themselves, what they need to change in others, and what they need to change with their organisation, with systems, with processes. They're conscious of bias. We've just talked about that. They understand it. They recognise that not only it happens on an individual level, but the organisation has its own blind spots as well. And they know that those can potentially be the organisation's downfall. They're culturally aware. They understand that not everybody sees the world through the same cultural contact lenses. They understand how their own culture and experiences impact their own behaviour. They value different perspectives, and they really work proactively to bring these to the table. They're curious, they have an open mindset, they look for learning, new ideas, new experiences. They know that different experiences enable growth. And finally, they're collaborative, and this is really important. They recognise they need to create a safe space. They have the power through their own role modelling and the way in which they behave. They create a safe space for people to share and collaborate. People can't bring all that value of diversity if they don't feel safe to do so. So there's very much a summary of inclusive leadership. Again, you can read more and learn more. And again, something for you to take away. Who's your great inclusive leader? Can you think of somebody who you work with now, or maybe in a previous role, who you could call an inclusive leader? What did they actually do? What did you experience in terms of their behaviour that enabled you to give them the title of an inclusive leader? You know, what made them stand out, and how did that impact you, your colleagues, your team? You know, it's just interesting to actually think what this means in practice and in reality. So maybe take that away and have a think about it. Okay, so just finishing with this last couple of slides then. If we don't consciously include, we will unconsciously exclude, or we run the risk of doing so. So it goes back to that difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity, yeah, we bring different people in, but actually we have to work. The organisation and each of us as individuals has to work at including everyone around us, and we must do that consciously and purposefully. Top tips, and I'm not going to look at each of these in great detail. Again, you can revisit the slides later on, but it's important that you make this topic relevant and accessible for everyone. You know, it can be seen as something just for a certain group of employees. Maybe people see it, that's something for those who are in a minority or maybe excluded already. It's not, it's for everyone. We can all feel left out at times. Make it relevant, make it accessible. Going back to that point, your bespoke business case, understand why this is important to you and bring people on board in that way. That's the way you'll get the buy-in of your leaders, and make sure you support and enable them around D&I. It can be quite a scary topic to be thinking of. There are many sensitivities around it. It can be triggering, and sometimes leaders are quite nervous. Be supportive, enable them around it. Build awareness, understanding and skills. Drip feed information about diversity and inclusion. let people think about it, make that become the norm, that people actually are engaging with this topic much more frequently. Work out what you're good at and where your gaps are, you know, undertake some sort of audit, and as part of that, hear employees' lived experiences. You can't know what's going on unless you have your employees telling you what it's like on a day-to-day basis in your workplace. Again, tailor your ED&I strategy. It goes back to what we were saying before, linked to your business case. Be explicit about who's accountable for all this. What are your expectations? How does this align with your organisational values, your company values? Know your starting point, measure progress. That's not always easy to do, but think about what good is going to look like and how you're going to know whether you've got there, whether you're making progress. Try to bring those diverse perspectives into everything that you do. You know, try not to work in that echo chamber. And finally, be persistent, but be patient on this, because change does take a long time to get there. Okay, so there are really many varied topics. I could have talked about others. We can start to explore these through e-learning and ideally through in-person training too, or other learning opportunities. I think enhanced awareness and understanding definitely helps minimise the risk of discrimination and of those legal challenges, but most importantly, it's going to play into that creation of a culture where everyone can give their best, and that's where the true value of diversity and inclusion lies. It's not about us and them, it's about each and every employee benefiting, and that critically flows through into tangible benefits for the business as well.
So as Anne neatly signed off there, just to explain that we at Marshall's have been developing e-learning courses for over 20 years now, and that continuous thread in our topics has been diversity. And the good news is that if you're a Ciphr customer, or if you're a prospective Ciphr customer, we've put some packs together of our content for you to purchase as part of your agreement. And we've put together initially 6 packs, and I'm going to focus on 2 of them today because they're specifically on diversity, which is the topic of this webinar. And these are off-the-shelf learning content packs that we've curated. The first pack, which is our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion pack. So very simply, there are 10 courses within this pack that we've put together, and with our experience, we've tried to make these as easy to and intuitive to work through. And we've often partnered with key presenters. So Anne has worked with some of these with key presenters to put courses together. I'm just going to pick out a couple that you can see on the screenshot there. So Let's Talk About Race is hosted by Maggie Semple, OBE, who's an inspiring inclusive leadership, was mentioned by Anne at the end, and Maggie is certainly one of those. That's one of our flagship courses. It's called Let's Talk About Race in the Workplace, and really discusses and talks about that topic in great detail, and it's inspiring as it's led. And there's a lot of video content in those courses, so they're easy to follow, and we've tried to make them as intuitive and break out from some of the boring stereotypes that e-learning can sometimes accompany. Also on that slide, just to pick out quite a new topic to the workplace is neurodiversity. And we worked with, again, another presenter, Lauren Duffy. So Lauren is a successful TV presenter and producer. She does podcasts. She's an incredibly successful person. She's an ambassador for the British Dyslexia Association. So again, who better to present our course on neurodiversity than Lauren, who suffers herself from, well, she has dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia. So yeah, so that's the first pack. It's got 10 courses. And then if we go into the second pack, so we have also a pack of micro-learning courses. So these are shorter courses. And so the first pack are sort of traditional standard length courses, about 30 to 40 minutes. But we took some feedback and from our customers that they were looking for sometimes shorter, more presenter-led courses. And so these courses that you can see in front of you are again on diversity, but they're 10 to 15 minutes, and they focus on individual topics that you might not be able to do justice in a catch-all ED&I course, traditional course. So these are very popular for refreshers. They're also very popular with people that are busy and on the go. People's attention spans are becoming shorter and shorter, so they're very good for the YouTube generation. They're presenter-led, so somebody talks you through the content, so they're very easy to consume. And so we find that people enjoy dipping in and out of topics just to refresh and enhance their skills on a certain topic. And so you can see that there's a familiar range of topics there that we've covered, but really we encourage people to dip in and out of these topics just to hone their skills, basically. Okay, and then just finally, just to touch on a little bit about pricing. So these packs are available. There are the 10 packs in the ED&I. So we have a tiered range of pricing based on the number of learners and the size of your organization. So just to give you an idea, the ED&I pack of 10 courses, that starts from 1,750, and that gives you learning up to 250 learners. The micro courses, there are 8 of those, so they're slightly cheaper, and that's at £1,500 again for up to 250 learner licenses. And really to call out, if you're interested, you want to know more, just get in touch. Please get in touch with your point of contact at Ciphr, and we can provide some more information. We've actually got a very nice document we can share where you can actually view all the courses in full just from a simple link. So that's a very easy way to familiarize yourself with our content and to see if you'd like to purchase them. And then, yeah, just have a look at the various courses, and we'll put something together as a proposal for you. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thanks so much, Gregor. Just to recap some of the things we've discussed today, ED&I is about so much more than compliance, and Ann's gone into great detail, brilliant detail, about why it's so important to businesses, the impact on engagement, and also bottom line, it's just so crucial to every facet of organising an organisation. When talking about ED&I, be specific and nuanced around the concepts you're discussing. What do you mean when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, or equality or equity, for example? Know the benefits and the opportunities. Think about your journey towards diversity, inclusion, maturity as a journey. And we looked at the Deloitte's model, which has 4 stages, 4 levels of maturity there. There's a need to understand varied topics around creating an inclusive culture, and there's lots of different nuances there that Marshall's e-learning courses and facilitated training and consultancy services can help you with, as they've already helped hundreds of organisations with their ED&I journey. So Anne, one for you from earlier, we were looking at systemic cultural barriers to diversity and inclusion within organisations. Kate was wondering what kind of examples there might be of these systemic cultural barriers and how we might be able to address those.
Systemic cultural barriers. I think the thing to remember is every workplace has its own way of doing things. Every workplace has its own norms that have grown up over time. What is accepted, what is usual practice in terms of the way in which people relate to each other, talk to each other, make decisions, attitudes to learning, how open people are, whether people are willing to speak up or encouraged to speak up if they see some behaviour that they're uncomfortable with, or that they can see somebody else is uncomfortable with. So I think, you know, every workplace, every company has a different company culture, and it's not necessarily a bad company culture. Many brilliant things about company cultures, but what you need to be sure of is that that company culture is not hindering or getting in the way of every person, every employee contributing to the best of their ability. And unless you actually ask people about those experiences, you're not really gonna know, because we all see things the way we want to see them. And what constantly surprises me, you know, when you talk to different people, is sometimes you've been talking about the same thing, you make that assumption that you're understanding it from the same perspective, and then somebody will say something and realize actually they've got a completely different way of seeing it to what you have. And I think, you know, it's very important to unpack that. So what I would say is ask people, and you can ask people in all sorts of different ways. You know, you can monitor and measure diversity by, you know, asking people to identify themselves in terms of different characteristics, and you can count the numbers of different people at different levels or in different roles within your organization. But what you also need to be doing, so that's kind of quantitative monitoring, but you also need to be doing that qualitative piece. You need to be offering people opportunities, either through things like focus groups or listening sessions, or you know, if you have staff networks, you know, to come and bring topics, or most normally through your maybe you have an annual staff survey. How do you embed diversity and inclusion into that survey? How do you ask questions about how people are feeling, whether they, you know, whether their manager is an inclusive line manager, whether they have opportunities to express a slightly different view, how comfortable they feel, you know, whether they've actually ever experienced harassment or bullying, and what the impact of that was. So give people lots of opportunities to tell you. What you've got to be careful about, obviously, is that you don't reveal identities when you come to report that, or when you come to analyze that information. You know, everything must be anonymous. You mustn't put people in jeopardy, otherwise they're just not going to share anything with you. But there are lots of different ways in which you can actually get that information about what people's experiences are of their everyday life at work. And if you don't ask, you can't be sure that you know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anne. A question that quite nicely links onto that from Patricia. She's asking, how realistic is this this goal of achieving inclusion? When we hear every day about household organisations being cited as inherently racist or with the systemic sexism problems, like, how realistic is it that we can make progress in this area or even become an inclusive organisation?
You know, it is quite depressing, isn't it? You know, I've been working in this area for a long time, and one of my first jobs was in the London Fire Brigade, and I used to work in their equalities unit. And you know, at that time there was a lot of you know, racism around, a lot of sexist behaviour when the first women started working as firefighters. A lot of really awful things happened, and yeah, you know, I mean, there was a report a couple of years ago which highlighted these issues still occur in the fire service, you know, but I'm thinking more about the police, and those sort of high profile types of organisation that we're looking at now. You know, similarly as a uniformed organisation, it feels like we can just think we're getting a little bit better at this, and then we go back and we just hear how another piece of research has told us how dreadful it is. So it's quite disheartening. But I think you know, what I would say is that, you know, and I know many of the organisations listening here may not be particularly large organisations, but what I do know is that the big corporates spend a lot of money in this area. They put a lot of resources in trying to create this inclusive workplace, this inclusive environment, this inclusive culture. So there must be something in it in terms of business benefit. There really, really must. But I think also it's so important because it's about the reputation of your organisation. As I mentioned in one piece of research, particularly young people, this is what they expect. They expect your organisation to be great in terms of diversity inclusion. And if you're not, if they don't see that on your website, they will choose, if they're looking for a job, they will choose another company which is similar but does have the, does talk about and with integrity about what they're doing on diversity inclusion. So I think it is important whether we will actually achieve it. It goes through ups and downs. There are a lot of positives. But we tend to focus on what's negative too. So I think we must remember that progress has been made, and that's why I say, be persistent but be patient. It's sort of courageous to do this type of work because you've got to be in it for the long haul. So I think, will we ever achieve 100%? Not necessarily, because naturally we're all biased and we all tend to, work in stereotypes and assumptions. So the world is never going to be perfect, but I think we need to continue to try to make it better, our workplaces.
Yeah, great, thank you. A question from Aisha here. They're currently looking at writing an ED&I strategy for their organisation. Do you have any tips for starting an ED&I strategy or useful resources to help tailor the strategy to our organisation? Gregor, if I come to you, I just thinking about the services Marshall offers, one of them which we haven't really talked about is consultancy services. Is this the kind of area where Marshall's team, led by Anne, sort of support with consultancy work?
Yes, well, I'm going to flip this back to Anne because Anne is our head of diversity.
I was trying to bring you in.
Part of our business. So you can effectively hire Anne to help. But Anne, do you want to maybe articulate a little bit more about some of those services that we could offer?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a real believer in, and I think that came through in my presentation, that you need to look at your organisation where you are. So I'm not going to say you need to do that, and that, and that. I think what you need to do first of all is work out. It goes back to that. What is the driver for this work? Why is it important to you? And then understand what you're currently good at and what you need to improve on. Maybe looking at that maturity model, but lots of other aspects as well. So some type of overview, review, audit, whatever you like to call it. And that can be as in-depth as you like, or kind of as helicopter view as you like. It doesn't have to take months and months and months. It can be quite a light touch if you like. And then, part of that again is talking to people. It's finding out about what is driving this. Why is it important for your organisation, and what is the reality currently? And then, in order to create a strategy and action plan, you base it on that. You work around different areas. You look at leadership, you look at governance, you look at how you monitor, how you measure, you look at your policies, you look at your processes, you look at your culture, and what are the gaps there, what are the strengths and gaps. So there are certain pillars that or areas of focus that you look at, and then you work out what your priorities are. But you always need to, and that's about bringing diverse perspectives to the table. It's not just about one person sitting in a darkened room and saying this is what we need to do. It's about finding out what current experiences are and what other people think about what would help, because what you're trying to do, it mustn't just be some bit of paper that somebody's written that bears no relation really. It's got to make a difference basically, and that's why bespoke and tailored work is so important. So absolutely, yeah, that's the type of work that I do. Also run webinars like this one, or on a particular topic in more detail, or run an action planning workshop with a board, or just familiarization, awareness raising, trying to create a safe space for people to talk about this. Did an action planning session with an organisation last week, which was what are you going to do to become an organisation that demonstrates racial justice? What does that actually mean? But it was more of a facility. I didn't give much input. It's more about enabling the people there to work it out for themselves, and then they get and then they become sort of committed to it and actually can buy into it. So training, consultancy, other learning resources, can design toolkits, whatever. Yeah, I mean, just ask. I always say no if I can't do it, but hopefully I can.
So a question from Gilly: we have a growing problem with a workforce self-diagnosing neurodiversity, particularly ADHD, and having to wait years with the NHS for formal diagnosis. Do they have the same legal rights, and we have to provide duty of care of someone with a formal diagnosis?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think neurodivergence falls within the definition of disability under the Equality Act, and you don't have to have I mean, let's say have a formal diagnosis. I mean, again, I would come back to this place that it's more than compliance. It sort of, even if you haven't got the formal diagnosis, that absolutely helps, because actually it gives you a better understanding, or hopefully would give you a better understanding of what that person's needs are and what you can do. But actually, in my view, you shouldn't be focusing on, is this proven, is it formal? If you've got an employee who comes to you and says, I have these issues, this is me, I need these things to help me do my job, it doesn't really matter whether they've got it written down on a bit of paper or the box has been ticked by the NHS or whatever. You need to think about how you can put those things in place to be most helpful for them. You know, the reasonableness does obviously come into it, and you have to decide what is reasonable. You know, if you're a small company, you can't afford necessarily thousands and thousands, or, you know, making one change might actually mean that other members of staff are disadvantaged by that in some way if you do choose to do something differently because of this one person. So reasonableness does come into it, but I would say, you know, your problem is you've got somebody who's not working to the best of their ability because they need some support. It doesn't really matter if they've got the diagnosis, although that is helpful, but I would plough ahead anyway, and I think that's part of your attitude and approach to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, it's almost like treating it as an employee comes to you with any other kind of issue that needs a bit of accommodation. It's the same as, I need to pick up my kids for a doctor's appointment. It's I need to spend a bit more time working offline or something like that. It's treating each person as an individual and supporting their situation as it is now and might be in the future. I'm speaking as someone who works with someone with ADHD, and we've had to figure out how to manage that and create an environment where they can work effectively. So I understand the challenges that presents, and it's just a case of taking them person by person, and you can't assume that everybody ADHD, for example, presents in the same way. They're all individuals, so that diagnosis is helpful but not the be all and end all. 2 more questions to go. Jackie asks, we are getting pressure from staff to have a designated ED&I lead, not working in HR but possibly in the CEO's office. Is this a common ask?
Yeah, it is really. It is really. I mean, you know, D&I traditionally sits within HR, but if you think about some of the business benefits that we've talked about, how important it is for D&I to flow through all kind of business functions, and if you want to get to that place where you know, it's much more integrated into the organisation and the responsibility tips over into senior leaders rather than into one person or 2 people who are in HR, it does make sense in the long run. And you know, many organisations have that model, although probably the majority still have their D&I person in HR. So it's not a bad place to start, but I think it's certainly something to consider, because that's how you get that reality of embedding. You know, if it's in HR, it's seen to be somebody else's job, somebody's job in HR to do it, whereas actually we want to, yeah.
Just to add, Anne, you've just written a new micro-learning course which is coming soon to add to that portfolio I talked about, which is about leading at an executive and board level, isn't it?
Yeah, we're creating some new micro learning courses, a new suite of 6, which will be not topic focused like the previous ones we had were like on neurodiversity, menopause, etc. But these are more for people who are in different roles within an organisation. So there's one around inclusive line management every day. There's one for, as Gregor mentioned, leading diversity and inclusion. There's one for recruitment, inclusive recruitment, so for hiring managers, etc. So yeah, those aren't quite ready yet, but they will be in the next month or so.
Okay, fab. And this is probably going to be my last question, I'm afraid, even though another one's just popped in. How do you deal with the chicken and egg situation where maybe you don't have a diverse people team and there may be a couple of people who are different in some way, but they're sceptical about the impact of diversity initiatives because the people team is maybe not as diverse as it could or should be?
Okay, well, I think you need to think who's going to influence some action in this area. You know, ideally, it comes back to that thing that we don't know what we don't know. And if you're a group of people who don't know very much about something or who haven't experienced the impact of maybe a negative impact of being different in some way, you know, why would you even think that you needed to address it? So 2 things, I would go back to that thing, at least understand that you have to ask a broader group of people about their experiences, and maybe you'd be surprised about what people are telling you. Maybe you wouldn't, maybe everything is fine, but yeah, you're right, it is chicken and egg. In an organisation where everybody looks the same, why would you be bothered about diversity? But I would, you know, come back to the business benefits. There's so much research now on what the business benefits, the extent of the business benefits that come from having diversity within an organisation, that you would be foolish to ignore that. The point about somebody, you know, can you find somebody who is passionate about this in your organisation? You know, a leader preferably who can drive this and who can ask some questions, be a bit of a critical friend to the organisation and start to move you to that place. There's also a whole concept about diversity nudges, which is around behaviours and getting people to behave slightly differently without actually being quite so in your face about it. I mean, if you look at diversity and inclusion nudges, there's 2 women who've written some work on that and given some really great examples of diversity nudges that can help take you in the right direction. And for a while, actually, Marshall's did actually produce what we called a diversity nudge every month, which was a 1-pager on a whole range of different, each on very different topics. And we provided this to clients every month with a view to that being circulated. So it just brings this into people's mindsets, you know, a diversity and inclusion related topic, something about that written in very accessible language, not complicated, not academic, but just trying to bring people into the conversation about why this is important, why it might be. So I think there are learning activities that you can do, but I would try to, again, get information about experiences, and you might be surprised about if it's just the people team that aren't very diverse, but the rest of the organisation is, you might be surprised at what you find. You can take it from there.
So thank you again for joining us and being so engaged and attentive. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you at another Marshall's webinar again soon. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you, everyone.